Howdy, folks. This is a video that was requested of me. I'm going to try and do it. I don't know um, if I'll ramble or get lost, or well, it's not really a subject it's a subject I understand. I totally understand it. I've just never have done anything talking about it. To me, it's always been there. It's the thing. Someone wanted to know about the Comics Code and what it meant or what it was or the history of it, or just do a video on the Comics Code. And I'm like, what's the Comics Code? It's that stamp you always saw. Is there anything interesting about it? Well, this stamp, you've probably seen it on comic books. If you read comic books in the 20th century, you saw it. It was on every book that you until maybe no, it was on every DC, Marvel, Archie, and Harvey book you would have seen. Definitely stayed on all of those until 2011. Well, not all of them. Some of them started dropping it. Archie definitely held it onto it till 2011. Anyways, let's talk about this. And what got me thinking about this and things about this was a live show that was done a couple weeks ago. I missed it. I came in towards the end as it was winding down, and the guest was signing out. But apparently, I watched it. I watched it afterwards, the replay of it, and yeah, it was it was raunchy a bit, slightly. It was certainly PG-13 for the most part, I would say. Not even R. Never got to R. So yeah, PG-13 for the most part. PG for much of it too. There weren't a lot of actual words. It was more just, God, I would say PG. It was just physical gestures of a woman acting sexy, but she was a bit tipsy. So she would put her finger in the mouth to simulate fellatio, but sometimes she would miss and put the finger on the side of her head. So it was more humorous than sexy, in my opinion. But it was certainly an attempt at being sexy and having fun with it. She didn't care. She was having fun. And there was nothing big deal. It's something you could watch on a sitcom, for the hell, for Christ's sake. So then, the person who did the live show, I really don't want to name any names. I don't want to give good or bad publicity to any of it. I would give good, but I don't want it that everyone involved, some people just don't need to be talked about. I found out there was a video reaction to the live show. So I watched it, and this one gal who is a perpetual victim, and no, it's not who you might think it is. It's someone I've never talked about, someone I hardly know. And she's just a perpetual victim, always being bullied. And she's talking through a puppet. And she's talking about how people are bullying her and they keep coming after her. And why can't she just make videos? They're not hurting anybody. They're normal, which was, I'm watching this, that's all fine. And then somehow at one point it shifts to where she says that she was watching a video the other night and it was horrible. This girl was doing disgusting things with her fingers. No, she wasn't. She wasn't, putting two in the pink and one in the stink or anything disgusting, or playing the slot machine or flicking the beat. She was just putting a finger in her mouth, crying out loud. It was very clean. But it bothered her so much that she contacted YouTube to have it taken down. And then 10 minutes later, she went back and it was still there. And she was so upset. And I thought, well, wait a second. It wasn't hurting anybody. Why do you want to have that taken down and nobody can bother you about your stuff? And it gave me my approach. It took still time to just think about what I do, what aspects in history I wanted to tie together. But I said, yeah, you know what? People have been doing that forever. They see something they don't like, and the reaction is, make it go away. I don't like it. Now, I'm going to start in 1930. And that's when sound film was introduced. And film, if you watch some stuff like the the Wise Guy, it's a Jimmy Cagney film. There's one scene where he smacks his girl in the face with a grapefruit. It's a pretty violent, he hits her, violent depiction of domestic violence. There was a lot of divorce and out of wedlock sex and all kinds of stuff that was happening between 1930 and 1934. You'll see some what we would consider really, you'd be like, that's not sweet and nice. No, they weren't sweet and nice. But of course, church groups and people and stuff, and the Hays Commission. There was a Hays Commission formed, and it formed in Hollywood, and they came up with rules for movies. And basically, the movie companies preemptively struck, and they created the Motion Picture Ratings Association. That's what I'm getting at. And so they kind of self-regulated themselves for many years. They still do now. And there is a wonderful documentary if you want to see how screwy this self-regulation is, but it also stops people, is you should watch This Film Is Not Yet Rated. And it talks about, how you would submit a movie to them and what bothered them and why and when and all these different things. And I'm like, God, that starts then and it comes to now and it's the same. And I also think, you look back and the church used to tell people that, Da Vinci that, he can't do his art, he can't do certain, some of the science. Galileo was an outlaw because they didn't like it. So make it go away. And there's a cat. Archie, please go away. No, you can sit there. Just be good. So brings from the 30s to now, and you'll see in the motion pictures, if you watch this movie, when they talk about ratings, how weird we still are about it and everything. It's sex. We're just so uptight about sex, and it's really strange. In the movie American Pie, they counted the amount of, and this will get to comic books, but they counted the amount of times Jason Biggs thrusted into the pie on the table. And when it was 3, they could do 3. It was like 6 or 7 times. The scene was much longer. He really was going at it with the pie. And they said, no, that's too much. 3 thrusts. And they were counting the thrusts. I mean, that's how weird these ratings get. They said, they took a movie and a guy goes down on a girl. It was acceptable. It was rated R, but acceptable. Girl goes down on a girl. It's not going to get an R rating. They said that's unrated. Guy goes down on a girl, and the girl has an orgasm. Unrated. So, I mean, and obviously a female orgasm, you're seeing the back of his head and her facial reaction. But no, a woman's pleasure, a woman and a woman, that they wouldn't. I mean, they're weird, and comics got just as weird. And what happened is a lot of church groups, a lot of schools went after comics from about the 1930s when they really became big in late 30s. So all throughout the 40s, people persecuted them. A lot of schools really said they promoted illiteracy and things like that. And they, I think they promote reading myself. And so do most people that I've talked to. But they came after them. And then suddenly in 1954, it wasn't, all those groups didn't do anything to them. But it was in the early mid-50s. It was 1954 that the comic code was established. But in the early to mid-50s, 2 books were written. Now, most people know about Seduction of the Innocent. And there was another one called Parade of Pleasure. And if your comic book gets mentioned in either of those 2 books, it's worth a ton now, in which I'm going to show you one of them that was a big deal. But this was enough because they were psychologists talking about how comic books harmed children's psyche. And all the creators always said, well, they're not just for children. They are intended. I mean, they're safe for children. We're not trying, but they're not intended for children, much like what happens on YouTube these days. It's, the whole, is it intended for children or is it safe for children? And that, anyways, so it went to Congress, and Congress debated on it. And one of the more famous books was this one by a guy named William Gaines. He's the man who invented Mad Magazine. It was EC Comics when which, funny enough, stood for Educational Comics, and then it became the home of true crime and true horror and all kinds of horror comics. But this one showing a bloody axe and a severed head, and they said that cannot be the cover of a comic book. You're crazy. That's how does this help people? And he made a famous quote that says, "Horror does no harm," and that's true. Who is harmed by a horror story? I mean, this didn't happen to anybody. Horror does no harm, and it was a real famous one. But he kind of got problems for that quote, and he said, "I'm not putting the code on my books," because they had invented the code at this time. And I also picked up this. I did look to see if there was anything on the history of ratings in major document. No, you can find out the history of creators, history of a lot of stuff, but no movies were really made on this history. So this might be what's out there. So they invented the code, and he said, "I'm not abiding by the code. There's going to, screw you guys." And the way comics were distributed, they went through the same magazine distribution that, I don't know what, Time and, well, there was no People in 1954, but Time and Newsweek and, hell, I don't know what, Life, I guess, would be around in 1954, whatever was going to the newsstands. And the comic books went to the newsstands, and that's where comic books went. And all the people distributing all the magazines said, well, if it doesn't have a code, we're not distributing it. And so he finally had to cave in, and like Mad Magazine and stuff got the code. Although I think Mad Magazine, one of their moves was to go from a comic book to a magazine so they could lose the code. But that's not something I researched before this, so I don't know. And here was the code. The code's ridiculous. You can read this yourself if you want, but there's, some major stuff and some weird stuff. Just like, let's look at number 12. Restraint in the use of the word crime in titles or subtitles shall be exercised. Restraint, well, I don't know what that means. So it's up to someone else if you've restrained it or not, Every instance good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. Now, these are general standards. Crime shall never be presented in a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust for the forces of law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals. Now, no comics shall explicitly present the unique details and methods of a crime. Most of this seems, it can sound okay, but you realize they're stories, and some of these things have to be available in a story. Like, you can't have black and white. Or you have to have black and white, I should say. You can't have, like, an anti-hero. You couldn't have had, at the time, a Punisher who is committing crimes, but he's the hero. They had no comics used horror, profanity, obscenity, smut, vulgarity, or words or symbols which have acquired understandable meanings are forbidden. I mean, that's a weird one. Religion. Ridicule or attack on any religious or racial group is never permissible. Nudity in any form is prohibited, as is the indecent and undue exposure, which meant those were a lot of jungle comics and good girl comics were out then, a lot of pinup stuff. Jungle comics especially, where there would be a Tarzan type character and a girl in a leopard type bikini. And they would always have her sexy looking, the look, Sheena, the jungle type of look. That was forbidden. A lot of stuff. Divorce shall not be treated humorously, nor represented. I mean, they had a huge code, and they said, this is it. We're going to put this code out to get the government off our ass. And it worked. The government got off their ass, and they ran with the code for years and years and years. And there were a very famous exception is in the early 70s. And that's an early exception and some funny stuff that happened. There was a Spider-Man comic. And in it, Stan Lee wanted to tell a story about drugs and a drug overdose that happened. And we're talking the early 70s. It was, a needle drug of sorts, probably heroin. I've never read the story, to be honest. It's a 2-part story. And the comic code said, no, this is not okay. You cannot show this. I would imagine the famous Green Arrow cover where Speedy is shooting up had to have been not gotten the code. I didn't look into that one. I was just thinking about the Spider-Man one. They didn't think out every possible exception to this and interesting thing, but there was a cover where Green Arrow and Green Lantern are opening up a bedroom door, and there is Speedy with a needle in his arm. And that's the cover of the book. That could not have been. And that was early 70s. It's a really good story, very famous story. Cannot be code. No way is that code. And the Spider-Man story was not code. But for the most part, still, they stuck to code. And there was one weird moment in the whole history of the code. A couple weird ones. But this one's one that always makes me laugh. Is there's a great creator. He's still working today. His name is Marv Wolfman. And in here they talk about the occult and scenes dealing with instruments. The Walking Dead, torture, vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism are prohibited. If you read that, number 5 under General Standards, Part B. Well, his name's Marv Wolfman. They couldn't put his name on the cover of his books he wrote for a while. Because he was Wolfman. That's always made me laugh. And finally, they just said that he's not a wolf man. And they got around all that. And the way they got around that stuff at first, you may have heard of these characters. There's a character called Morbius, the living vampire. And he's not a vampire. He gets a blood transfusion that's tainted, and it gives him vampiristic traits. And now he hunts vampires. But he's a vampire. He needs blood. He has to go rob blood banks and all that. So, and there's a movie of him coming out whenever movies come out again, starring Jared Leto as Morbius. It's a big deal comic. I mean, he's a character that has always been a minor character. But the idea of him coming in was they wanted to make a vampire character, but how can you do it if you can't have vampires? And they found ways around. The other one is Werewolf by Night. He's not a werewolf. If you read the stuff, he somehow got a enchanted stone. So if he gets, and only at night will he turn into the werewolf, but he's not really a werewolf. He wasn't bitten by a werewolf. It's not werewolfism. And they got away with little tricks like this to get out the horror comics of the early 70s. And for the most part, things kind of just kept loosening up. If you go back, actually, we should go back a little bit to the 50s. The biggest thing was, or a big thing was homosexuality. The homosexuality in comics. Which, I can't say I completely hate them going after it because it did help create my favorite character. But they invented, at the time, in like 1959, they were going, because what survived the code was Superman, Action Comics, Batman, Detective Comics, and Wonder Woman. Everything else from DC and Marvel, all superheroes, were gone. So throughout the 50s, that's what you had. And they were all the wholesome stories. And people started looking at Batman and Robin and going, this is a little weird. guy living with this kid, and they're not. It's not his son. So they introduced the first Batwoman and Batgirl, which was, and they were a woman and her cousin. They were Batwoman was a love interest to Batman, with the Batgirl character being a love interest to Robin. And that's not my favorite character. My favorite character is actually the Barbara Gordon Batgirl, which was the same thing. When the show came on TV, I guess for the first year, they said it's kind of gay. And they said, yeah, let's bring in a girl. They brought in Batgirl, who then made an appearance in the comic books. She actually did appear in the comic books first, was invented for the TV show. And you know her, Yvonne Craig. It was because they were afraid. Well, people are weird about gay stuff. That even the Hulk TV show, we know the Hulk is Bruce Banner. You've seen the movies, but he's not Bruce Banner on the TV show. What did they change his? I don't remember now. They changed his name to another Banner because Bruce, it's a gay name, Brucey. They thought Bruce was too gay. That's a serious thing. That's not a joke. Like thinking in one of the cartoons with the Fantastic Four, there's a couple theories where they decided to take out Human Torch and replace him with a robot. And that was done for two reasons. One reason is not because kids would light themselves on fire and think they could fly. That's a pretty commonly thought reason. No, the two reasons were Human Torch himself was up for possibility of another thing. They didn't really have the rights to him. Plus, they felt the Flame was just too hard to animate. That's it. Had nothing to do with but Batgirl was brought in because Batman and Robin seemed too gay. So we get through some of the horror comics of the 70s. We bring it through the 80s. Everything was it just got looser and looser. They weren't as hardcore about, the villain always had to be punished, but not at the end of the book. You could get like a 4 or 5 part story, but always the villain in the end of the story getting punished. And then you got, and actually the change in distribution happened in the 70s, but it really wasn't until the 90s that it got locked down as a solid thing. Comic book stores started forming in the late 60s and 70s. They were pretty prevalent in the 80s, and they were huge in the 90s. And all these independent comic companies like Image and Dark Horse and, Mirage Studio, I don't know, I can't name it, but they didn't even have the code. They didn't deal with it. They went through the direct distribution, which did not use the code, and only DC, Marvel, Harvey, and Archie still went, and Harvey was Richie Rich and Casper and all that. They still went through the grocery store distribution as well as Marvel. And it was in the 90s that you saw a big thing. The change was a UPC on the covers. And I guess that came up in the 80s, the UPC. But there was always a UPC on the cover because they needed that for grocery stores. Or when they started needing it for grocery stores, they also replaced it. So there was just Marvel had a picture of Spider-Man, DC had a DC symbol. I don't know what Archie and other stuff had, but that would appear in the little square where the UPC was. And that had more to do with pricing of the books and returnability and all that kind of thing. Because also grocery store stuff was returnable, but you'd get like 40%, 30% off. And it was 30% off cover price. But you could return everything. And if you went through the distribution, you could order way ahead of time, be guaranteed what you wanted. And it was not returnable, but you got 50% off. But that's not about the code. So basically, we're done. The code went to... started disappearing. Marvel, DC dropped the grocery store distribution, and by It was in the 2000s, 2011. It was by 2011 is when Archie finally said, we don't even need the code anymore. And they dropped it. I mean, Archie was the last holdout, if I'm not mistaken. So that was kind of the history of the code. To me, it's I don't like it, make it go away thing. They were trying to find ways. They didn't like the homosexuality in the books. Make it go away. I don't want the scary werewolf in the book. Make it go away. And they just didn't have the ability to not read it or not watch it or turn the channel. Or I don't know what it was, but that's kind of a human nature thing. It existing bothered them. So that's my kind of take on the code and why it came about, how it came about. And I'm sure I missed a lot of really big parts on it. But as far as I know, with my looking, this is about the only thing you're going to find out about the code of someone being done. There is another comic books channel called Comic Tropes. He has not done the code. He has done some of the most, if he had done the code, I never would have touched this because he's just brilliant. The man knows his comic books like no one else. His last article was on the Platinum Age of comics, which is prior to like Superman and all that, when they used to just take comic strips from the newspaper and print them in book form. And you had the Yellow Kid and some stuff like that to me was just, I was fascinated the whole half hour I watched his show because it was stuff I just didn't know. So to me, that's, but so there it is. A small history. If you liked it, leave a comment. Give me an idea for something else you'd like to hear my take on, because I'm really not. I get called an expert on comics. I'm not. I am so not. I read a lot of comics. I read a lot about comics. But, God, there's so much I have to learn every time someone asks me anything about it. So, but I'll look into it, and I'll do it if I can. So go ahead and make suggestions or whatever, and we'll give it a try. It might take me a while to think about what I want to say, but I'll eventually come up with something and make you a video. All right. Thanks a lot, folks. Have a good one.